Welcome to the latest episode of the Men's Mysteries podcast. Today I thought I would talk about the topic of, are you a safe person to be with? And this is in part a response to a recent episode that Trevor Bone put out on his podcast where he was basically talking about that same topic. And while I found myself agreeing with some of his points, I also found myself disagreeing with some of his points. I thought I'd present my own perspective on this topic because I think that there's a tendency in men's work, and it's something I'm going to call out here, where the tendency is that men are the problem, men aren't safe to be with, and we have to make ourselves safer to be with in order for women to feel safe. And while I agree with that in part, I think there is a lot of validity to that. I also think there's something to be said for the fact that men don't necessarily feel safe either. Now, some people are going to say, well, okay, Taylor, but men are the ones who typically cause the most harm. You know, like if we look at physical violence, for example, men are definitely more often than not the perpetrators. If we look at rape, men more often than not are perpetrators. If we look at what's going on, like for example in the US right now, it's men who've taken away, essentially men who've taken away abortion rights and things like that. And you know what? 100%, I agree with all of that. Not arguing it at all. I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think it's important to acknowledge that how men show up matters. I want to be very clear about that. And I also want to speak to this as a man who has experienced some degree of a lack of safety in my own life when it comes to the women I've had in my life. Mentally, emotionally, and sometimes physically. I have not felt safe with women. And I think that you know, I think really, if we look at it, it's important to acknowledge that. Sometimes people don't feel safe with each other. And the question is, what is the solution? Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'd appreciate it if you liked it and if you comment on it and share it with people. And if you're on the Men's Mysteries Substack watching this, I'd love it if you could heart it, restack it, share it, and again, offer your own commentary. Here's the thing that I'm going to say that's going to seem really interesting, though. If I look at my own life, I can say that early on in my childhood, I grew up in a situation where it was abusive. My dad was physically and mentally abusive with me, so was my stepmom. So it makes sense that I didn't feel safe, both with men and with women. Because I didn't. I didn't feel safe with either. And I would say that even my early sexual experiences with women were not altogether healthy ones. The second and third women that I was with were both women who were older than me. One of them was a family member who incested me, and one of them was just an older woman who wanted to be with me. And she was older than me by almost 20 years. And while she didn't necessarily physically harm me, there was definitely an emotional impact and a mental impact that shaped my experience with women in years to come after that. And I think a lot of times what we men don't realize is that we have to learn how to be safe with ourselves if we're going to be safe for other people. I don't know that I didn't know how to be safe with myself. I didn't fundamentally trust myself for a long time, and that made me feel really like I could not trust other people in my life. when I look back at the relationships that I was in, I can see how I didn't show up in a way that engendered a sense of safety with the feminine. So I think that's something that's really important to own, because if we men want to have, and I'm talking about this from a cisgender heterosexual perspective, I fully acknowledge that not everyone who watches this is necessarily going to come from that orientation. Fair enough. But that's my orientation, so I'm speaking to that. If I look at how I show up in relationship with women, I think that it's really important for me to acknowledge and accept that if I didn't feel safe with myself, I certainly was not necessarily somebody that a woman would feel safe with. Because a woman's going to detect that on some level, and she's going to be aware of that. I also think that it didn't really help that I learned a lot of what I would call misogynistic and patriarchal behaviors from my dad. I mean, my dad was a philanderer. He was a serial cheater. He cheated on every single one of his wives. And he would flirt all the time with people. And I grew up watching that, and I was embarrassed by it, and yet I also picked it up. And it took me a long time to undo that particular pattern. And even in being aware of it and knowing that I didn't necessarily like it, I still found myself doing it a lot of the time. And I want to be very clear, I'm not letting myself off the hook, because the truth of the matter is that was what I learned. And so I felt like that was the best way to relate to women. And I don't know, again, that really made the woman in my life feel safe. Certainly the woman that I was with didn't necessarily feel safe, even like in an open polyamorous relationship, because there was always that sense of ambivalence. Is this person really in? And the truth of the matter is I wasn't really in my relationships. When I look back at my relationships with different women over the years, I can safely say that I was not fully in. I didn't know how to be in. When I talk about in, what I'm really talking about is like being fully committed. Like on some levels, I was definitely committed. And on other levels, I didn't know how to be committed. And I think that's a really important distinction to make. And I think it's one of the problems that a lot of men face. And I want to be clear here, I'm not knocking open or polyamorous relationships. I'm actually in a polyfidelitous relationship at this point. So there is more than one person in my life. And you know, that those relationships are really important to me. I'm in with those relationships. I'm committed to those relationships and to helping and to being like a solid, stable presence with those relationships. And it took me a long, long time to figure that out. I even in the wake of my most recent relationship that I got out of, I was spending a lot of time reading some books and really doing a deep dive into myself. Is like, how do I want to show up in relationship moving forward? Because there were lessons I learned. And this was after I'd been doing some men's work, really working on my presence, working on my awareness, working on being more grounded in myself so I could show up better. And this is one of the things that I think a lot of women look for from men is like, can this man be grounded? Can he show up? Can he be fully present? Well, I can't be fully present if I'm not feeling safe with myself. I can't be fully present if I'm not grounded with myself. I can't be fully present if I haven't learned how to trust myself. And this is one of the realizations that I've had in my own work around relating to women. And really just my own work in relating to people in general. How in am I with these people? How much am I really showing up for these people? What can I do to be better for these people? What can I do to be better for myself? And part of that means that I've had to really look at how I haven't felt safe with other people. So I haven't always felt safe. I've been in relationships where I've been with people where there were times where, like, you know, someone would throw something, for example, across the room, and that did not feel safe for me at all. I've also been that person who sometimes has shouted and yelled and being a very tall man. I'm 6'3". I look back now and I'm like, wow, was I really aware of like how physically intimidating I could be? And I think that's one of the things that like a woman's going to ask herself is, can I be safe with this person? This person may more than likely be physically stronger than me, may have some other things. Can I really be safe with this person? Am I going to know that I'm safe with this person? Not, can this person keep me safe from other people around me? Can I actually be safe with this person? And that was a point that Traver made that I agree with. And yet, what I would ultimately also ask is, can I be safe with this person? There's a quote that Traver mentions in his book that, like, I think it was Margaret Mead who basically said that men are worried about getting laughed at, whereas women are worried about getting killed by men. Like, men are worried about getting laughed at by women. Women are worried about getting killed. And it's a very interesting quote. It does really make you think. Yet I will say this, that maybe there's been that concern about being laughed at, but you know what what the fear that has really struck with me and been at my heart is, am I going to get broken by this person? Is this person going to break me emotionally, mentally, spiritually? They may not be able to break me physically, although they might if they know where to hit and everything else, but are they going to break me in other ways? And I think that is one of the fears that men have, and it's not a fear that's really talked about. So it's like, oh, all the onus is on men to make everything safe. Well, a lot of the onus is on men. I would say the majority of the onus is on men. And I say that because some people who watch this may not even agree with that. They may be like, no, it's all on women. No, I don't think so. The majority of the onus is on men. And the reason for that is we just have to look back at our history and recognize that up until, like, say, the 1970s, a woman had to be married to a man in order to have a bank account or have a credit card. We look at the fact that up until very recently, abortion was a guaranteed right in the United States and now no longer is. If we look at the fact that, the majority of domestic violence is men hitting women. If we look at the fact that the majority of rape is men raping women. Now, is all of it? No. There are situations and experiences where men have also been harmed. I am not denying that at all. It's true. And I say this as someone who is a sexual trauma survivor. I've had multiple experiences. And I also say this as someone who has sometimes done some things that I look back on now with a lot of regret. And I've done my work around those things. I've done my work to become a quote unquote better man, a safer man, a man who is more aware of himself and how he shows up. And even to this day, I still find myself sometimes having to really look at my own behavior and say, am I showing up in integrity and authenticity? Am I showing up in the best way possible? But I think this is a question that ideally we are all asking ourselves, regardless of how we are engendered. And for men, I think it's an especially important question because there is a very real pressure on men in terms of how they show up. A while back, I wrote an article about like this one guy who put out there, "Your body, my choice." And I got a bit of flack about it from a couple men who were upset, who kind of felt like, and some of it was, and I'll legitimately own this, the way that I wrote it wasn't necessarily maybe the best way. I could have shared some of it maybe a little bit differently, and yet at the same time, like, I was also like, well, but that's how I feel. Like, I have a real problem with that particular meme. And anyone who is like gleeful about it and like, yeah, that's the right way it's like, no, that's not. And again, I say this as someone who has been a sexual trauma survivor. When the power of choice is taken out of your hand, when you are victimized as a person and your body is used for someone else's pleasure without your consent, it is a horrifying feeling. It is a feeling of powerlessness. It is a feeling of trauma. And for anyone who might be triggered by this, I apologize for that, but I'm going to share that because most of my audience, I suspect, is men, and I want you to realize that. If you have never been in a situation where you've experienced that, you can't really know. And you can get upset about some of the things that I'm saying here, and that's fair enough, but at the same time, I'm going to challenge you to really look at your own life and ask yourself, how many times have you been powerless? How many times have you been in a situation where you haven't felt safe? And I'm going to also acknowledge at the same time that men do a lot of the behaviors they do because they are trying to be safe. Emotionally, mentally, and other ways. Like when I look back at my nice guy behaviors, I wasn't operating from a place of being afraid of being laughed at. I was operating from a place of being afraid of getting hurt and getting broken. I was trying to figure out and strategize and calculate the best possible way to show up in order to partially get what I wanted, whether that was sex or acceptance or approval or love, but also partially to protect myself because I was afraid of getting hurt. Woman's anger scared the fuck out of me. And I don't say that as a condemnation of a woman being angry. Women have a right to express and feel their anger. I say that because from my own experience of women's anger has been one where I have not felt safe. When I was grabbed and shaken as a child by my stepmom and yelled at, I didn't feel safe. When I've had something thrown or something broken or someone stomp around and yell or express or some other form of thing, I have not felt safe. And I also acknowledge that sometimes I haven't made someone feel safe for similar reasons. I yelled, I got upset, or whatever else. I mean, one of the things that I have really worked hard to do in general is to express my anger, but do it without necessarily letting my physiology control the response. One of the books I'm reading right now is, it's a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, and it's been really interesting to sit with and explore, like, how has my own physiological responses really a response to epigenetic experiences. I have to factor in and accept and acknowledge the fact that there is a history in my family of physical and mental abuse that didn't just start, like with my dad, or, it went further back than that. I don't know all the details, and yet I know that it's true. And I know that my physiology isn't just responding to my own experiences, it's responding to other experiences. And this is where it comes down to how do we make ourselves feel safe? How do I feel safer in the world? How do I show up in a manner where I'm like, I can feel safe with you? So I think the question of men being safer to be around is much more nuanced. It's not just a matter of men being like, oh, like, okay, we have to, be safer for women. It's men learning how to be safer with themselves. We can't be safer with other men or with women until we learn how to be safer with ourselves. And that's where this work starts. And this is one of the reasons why I do men's work. I want to be safer for other people. I want to recognize where I have not created an environment of safety for other people. And I want to recognize where that is rooted in not feeling safe in and of myself. And that doesn't give me an excuse. That doesn't justify my behaviors. If anything, it's wow, I've got to really recognize and take ownership of where I haven't felt safe and where where I wasn't necessarily operating from a place of integrity. I wasn't operating from my values. I wasn't operating from a place of sovereignty. And that's my responsibility. And some of that's also my healing. I'm not responsible for the way people treated me when I was a young kid. I am responsible for what I do with that now. So when I look at this idea of safety and what that really means, I look at it from a perspective of how can I be relational with myself? How can I give myself the healing and presence that I need? So then I can give that healing and presence to other people. How can I show up for myself so I can show up for other people? And as I have stated to my beloveds, I can only show up for you as much as I show up for myself. So if I'm not fully showing up for myself, I'm certainly not showing up for other people. And that in and of itself is an area where more safety could be found. There have been times where I have felt like I've been walking on eggshells with other people. There have been times where I've been afraid when somebody yelled or got angry or slammed a door or did something else like that. And when that same person would ask me to shut a door quietly or to, be quiet or be quieter or whatever else, and yet at the same time, then they would just kind of go and do the opposite, that didn't land well with me. And that's kind of where I'm at with all of this is like, look, it's really about all of us learning how to be safe with each other. Is there an onus on men? Yes. Is it fair? Maybe, maybe not. I know there are some men out there who are going to say it's not fair, that they shouldn't have to be that way. And I'm just going to point to them and say, look at the history here. Who has been in a position of power, typically, traditionally, in the household? Who's been calling the shots? And maybe some of those men, that's what they really want. They want to go back to those days. Well, whether you like it or not, civilization has changed. People have changed. And even though right now in the United States there is this resurgence of what I'm going to call patriarchal thinking, and there are a lot of white men in particular who are beating their chest and doing other things that are not necessarily, I think, certainly not something I really care for. I recognize on the one hand it is kind of like a backlash, a response to how much things have changed. And kind of like a, hey, we can't let it change too much. And I also recognize that a significant aspect of it is really that these same people, here's where I identify with the humanness of it, is that these same people want in one sense to feel heard. But the thing is that, they can raise their voices and other people get the right to raise their voices too. Like I know, for example, that not everyone's going to watch this and agree with what I share. And I'm okay with that. Not everyone's going to approve of what I've said here. Some people will feel like I've gone too far. Some people will feel like I've not gone far enough. Other people will just be like, well, whatever, this is just another white man talking. More power to you. You have whatever opinion you have about this. I still genuinely do feel that the onus is on men in terms of what's going to create a sense of safety. And I also recognize that men don't necessarily feel safe. I haven't felt safe in a long time up until recently when it comes to relationship. When I look back at the last couple of relationships in particular, I didn't feel safe in those relationships. Some of that was me. Some of that was actions I did, choices I made. Some of it was me operating from older behavior patterns. I own that. That's on me. And in some ways, when I look at those relationships, I recognize how I projected past relationships onto those and how that created some of the problem and how unfair that was to those people. By no means am I putting it on them fully. And there were some things going on with those people where I genuinely, legitimately had a right not to feel safe. I mean, especially feeling like I came out of those relationships feeling broken in some ways. I want the world to be safer in general. And I think that starts with ourselves. It starts with recognizing the trauma that we're carrying, the issues that we have, all the stuff that's coming up for us, and being gentle and relaxed and present, compassionate and kind, having boundaries. Always have to have boundaries, and I think that's a good thing, but being able to operate from a place of kindness. Do I think that quote that I mentioned earlier is accurate? Not really. I think it is very easy to say something like that and harder to recognize that there may be some legitimate reasons that someone doesn't feel safe. And I also recognize there's a lot of history. There's a lot of history, and it can rightfully be pointed out at the fact that, especially in the last, we'll just say, I don't know, 1,000 to 2,000 years, maybe even more, maybe all along, men have typically held the power. Men have typically had the control. Men have typically been the ones making the decisions, calling the shots, and women have basically been like, I hope this person isn't going to fuck me over or hurt me or make me or damage me. And when you add the physical level of harm, and I'm not saying that men don't ever get physically abused, because that can happen, as I've mentioned in regards to my own experiences. But when the majority of times it's men causing harm, there is a legitimate reason and right for people to say, well, I want men to be safer. You know what? I want that too. I want men to be safer. I want to be one of those safe men. I am actively working on being one of those safer men. And it's a continual work. It's an everyday experience. It may be an everyday experience for the rest of my life. And I'm okay with that. That's kind of what is the reality. So I'm just going to wrap this up here, and that's kind of my thought on this topic. I think it's an important one. And I invite those of you who are watching this that, if you want to transform your relationship with yourself, check out my program, The Sovereign Code. This is about learning how to become the sovereign of your life. This is about learning how to master yourself as a person, as a man, so that you can truly show up and be safe for yourself, and as a result, be safer for other people. And when you do that, you're going to operate from a place where you are in alignment with your core values, with your boundaries, with everything else that can help you create that reality. All right, thank you for watching, and have a great day.